Hello, Julia Usher, Recipes for a Sweet Life. Welcome back. I've got a fabulous Easter project for you in the form of this lovely little Easter basket up front that's been wrapped in SugarVeil lace and then piped. It also makes a wonderful spring or May Day gift as well. Just picture it filled with flowers instead of Easter eggs and you've got a beautiful May Day basket. Let's talk first about the cookies and other elements needed for the project. There are only 4 cookies needed for the project, 2 cylinders. These are about 2.5 inches tall, and they wrap around a 2 3/4 inch diameter cylinder. They sit on a 3 3/4 to 4 inch base. And then I've got this cute, delicate little fluted handle that I've actually cut using 2 rather conventional cookie cutters, and I'm going to show you how to do that in a bit. It's not a single cut, it's 2. In addition to those cookie elements, we're going to be working with a number of royal icing transfers, simple round ones, which I've already discussed in another video, little roses, which I've also discussed in another video, ferns, which I'll be showing you how to pipe. They're really fun, 2-tone ferns, and little ribbon roses, which are a variation of the other rose. I will also briefly touch on these since I haven't shown these in another video. Lastly, we've got some non-royal icing transfer elements, little fondant plaques that say Happy Easter, and tiny little wafer paper ribbons, all completely edible, and I've got a whole other video about how to shape and form bows as well, so we won't get into that here. We'll just simply be applying them to the handle in the end. So let's start first with how to shape these more complicated elements, namely the cylinders and the handle. Okay, cookie pieces. Again, my base was just cut with a conventional fluted round. This is a double-sided round, which is kind of cool, from an Atico cutter set. I stock up on the Atico sets because I use them for my more general shapes quite often. Now, as far as this little handle is concerned, let me show you how I did that. It's a very delicate piece, so as with all delicate pieces, I like to roll them directly on a silicone mat and transfer them on the mat to the baking sheet without lifting them off the mat. This way they don't distort at all. And I'm rolling that about 1/8 of an inch thick because I want a fairly delicate handle. And here, to create the outer edge, I've used this fun plaque cutter. I forget the name of it, but I'll have it listed in the video description. It's from Cookie Cutter Kingdom, and I just thought it was a really graceful shape. So that's going to become the outer portion. And then I've taken a conventional oval cutter, and if you can see, I've kind of squished it. Hopefully I can unsquish it when I want to, just so that I can cut a narrow oval within the center of this. And that's going to become the handle. I have to get kind of overhead to make sure it's centered properly. We're only going to take about 2/3 of this piece as the handle. So we're going to remove both the inner ring. I usually leave the outer dough down until I cut out the inner piece, because if I don't, sometimes the cutting of the inner piece can cause the outer piece to misshape. So that looks beautiful. I am just going to trim it about here to create the handle because I don't need the whole piece. And then I'd continue, of course, to fill out as much of a single silicone mat as I could, then simply slide it up onto the back of my baking sheet and stick it in the oven. This is a relatively thin and delicate piece, so it probably needs a little less baking time than I typically take on my cookies, which is 10 minutes. So under that, maybe 8 minutes. But keep an eye on it. You just want it lightly browned around the edges. Now for the cylinder, we're going to bake those in 2 pieces and piece them together. It's much easier to bake a cylinder in halves because if you try to bake in the full round, some side of the cookie will need to be put down on the baking sheet. And I'm going to flour this surface pretty liberally because in this case I do need to move the dough off the mat and up onto the cylinder. And I want to make sure that this dough is free sliding at all times. So it needs to be about 2.5 inches tall, as I said, and about 5 inches long to get halfway around the cylinder. And I think I've got it just about there. But before I cut it, I do just want to make sure, again, that I can move it around easily for lifting purposes. And that's going to sit directly on the cylinder on its side. I've just got it tucked into a tin container that is used to house cookie cutters to keep it stable in the oven. You could sit it in another big cookie cutter, but that seems to fit it rather perfectly. Mark off points at 2.5 inches on either side to create a straight line. And right now I'm leaving the ends rough. I'll trim them when they get up on the cylinder. I want to move the cylinder just a little bit closer to me and then quickly lift it, gently wrap it around. I need it only to go halfway around. So I'm going to trim off the excess, and I do that pretty quickly before it can weigh down the dough and stretch it and cause it to break. So that looks good. It's about halfway around. I'll cut another piece just the same way, bake them off. When it comes out of the oven, immediately you just want to take your same thin-bladed paring knife and run all the way along the edge, maybe both edges. Make sure it's free rotating on the cylinder. Let it cool completely, and then you can slide it off. If you don't dislodge it immediately, sometimes it can stick. Okay, we'll set those aside, get them in the oven, and come back to talk about some of the other accessories that are going to go on the basket. So for this two-tone project, you can load 2 different colors of icing in one bag, but I'm choosing to use this Cake Boss product. It's relatively new. There are other ones on the market as well. It's actually a 2-chamber piping bag, and I'll load one color, the light green, on one side and the dark green on the other side. And this just makes a much more distinct variegation than I've ever achieved when I've just loaded the colors in the bag myself. You can also insert one bag, plastic bag, into another disposable plastic bag and create kind of the same effect. But the unique thing about this as well that makes it that much better, it's a little hard to see, it's also got a divided coupler at the end. So that also helps to guide the icing in separate channels through to the ultimate tip. Even if you insert your own disposable bag into another disposable bag and try to do the same thing, it never quite works the same way. So I do like these. So we're going to go ahead and do this. This bag is super huge for what I'm trying to do. Now I want these leaves to have a bit of texture. So my icings are relatively thick, but not too hard to pump through the bag. I'm going to load the green on one side, light green on one side. Always fold down the top of the bag so you don't get that messed up. So you'll see the icing is relatively thick, still clings to a spoon. And that's good for creating texture. It's not quite as thick as my glue consistency, which is hard to press through a bag. It's a little bit thinner than that. Maybe 3/4 of a teaspoon of water added to every cup of my glue would yield this consistency. I'm going to start working that light green down into the bag just by shaking it in. You need a little more dark green in there. This can also be done by sticking the bag in a cup and loading it that way. I tend never to do that. It ultimately ends up in the same place. So once you've worked your icing all the way down to the bottom, and again, I probably could have trimmed this off so I don't have so much excess there. I'm not doing massive amounts of piping here. Just give it a test pipe on your work surface to make sure both colors are coming out on either side. And if they're not, you may need to rotate your tip a little bit to allow for exposure of both colors. Usually it's just an issue of the tip rotation. For transfers, I always pipe on acetate. I think it lies flatter than parchment paper, and you can see through it to any tracings you have underneath. Here I've just traced 2 guidelines. These are the height of my basket. They're about 2.5 inches. So if I want really long ferns going all the way up the sides, I'll know just how much to pipe them. So the motion here, starting with the clean tip, is to push forward, pull back, push forward, pull back, push forward, pull back, so on and so forth. In a continuous motion until you have it as long as you want, and then abruptly pull back to create a peak. This icing is a pretty good consistency. It could be a little bit thicker to hold more shape, but I think they'll dry pretty nicely. We'll do that a few more times. So once you've piped out a whole sheet of these, I put my acetate, of course, on something that's at least semi-supportable, if not cardboard, something that's semi-rigid, so that I can move this to the side without breaking and disrupting my transfers and allow them to dry. Okay, the next accessory I want to talk about are the ribbon roses. So these particular fun roses. As I mentioned earlier, these other more traditional roses I've covered in another video. I'm going to show you how to make these. So for these ribbon roses, remember this is sort of what we're going for. This is one I just recently piped. And I just want to explain my setup here. I like to pipe on rose nails with a little bit of parchment paper stuck down with a little bit of shortening, so that once I pipe one, if I don't have a ton of rose nails, I can move that off to another plate, just put another slip of parchment paper on there and reuse the rose nail. The rose nail is key because it allows me to rotate as I pipe rather easily. I need to do a lot of rotation to create this particular flower. Now, just a word on the icing I'm using. Again, it's relatively thick, similar in thickness to what I used before with the green ferns. If you were to come back tomorrow, this icing might still be stuck to the spoon. So this is very close to my glue consistency. I work really thick with roses typically because I like to get a little roughness to the edge. You'll see there's a little rip and tear in the edge, and that's really only possible with a very thick icing. I'm working with a 101 tip to create that size, and of course if you 101 petal tip, and you'll notice it is wide on one end and narrow on the top. And I want the narrow end facing up always so I get a nice fine edge to my flower. But you can vary the size of the tip, as I was going to say, and create these just in different sizes. So I always start by putting a dab of icing down to anchor the flower. And then I'll start with my tip, the point angled in kind of towards the center to create a point. And I'm rotating this rose nail as I'm doing that. I'm going to try to do that rather continuously. Usually I reach a point right here where I can't continue to rotate and I have to pause and kind of regroup. But that creates just a little swirl flower. Now I had my tip angled in pretty much the whole time I rotated, so it's relatively closed as opposed to this one, which is more open because I had the tip facing more upright. So let me try to replicate that look. And that's just the simple difference of the orientation of the tip. So rather than pointing it in towards the center of the rose nail, I'd have it more perpendicular to it, if that makes sense. Starting again with a dab. I'm going to point it in to start, but I'm going to make a conscious choice to raise it as I go around. That's a little more open, not quite. I think I was still holding it at somewhat of an angle. But that's the basic gist. You could allow them to dry here if you're only going to do a few and then pull them off later. Or, as I said, move them aside and continue your piping process. Once they're completely dry, they'll literally pop off the parchment. And for icing this thick, that could happen in a few hours, depending on your ambient humidity. Okay, so on to these little contoured plaques made of fondant. I don't need much fondant. You can make these in any shade. I'm going to use light yellow because it's going to coordinate with some of the piping we're going to do on the sides of the basket a little bit later. And I'm rolling it through to start at number 1 on my pasta machine just to get it going. And then I'll gradually advance it to number 3 setting, which is about 1/16 of an inch thick. There we've got a nice little sheet. We're going to be stamping it. I've got this fun little letter stamp that I got at Office Depot that I used to create little plaques, similar plaques, on my pot of gold cookies. So to stamp, I stamp on fondant the same way pretty much that I stamp on cookies. I start by inking what was an uninked plain stamp pad with food coloring. And by inking, I mean I'm applying food coloring. And this is nothing more than my normal liquid gel food coloring that I use in my icings. And I've blotted off the excess food coloring so I don't get too much here on the stamp. Yeah, that's perfect. Now I want to cut out the plaque after I've stamped it because if I cut first and then try to stamp in the process of stamping the fondant, I can misshape the plaque, nice plaque shape. And again, this 2-inch little plaque is from Cookie Cutter Kingdom. I love some of their plaque cutters, and I'm just looking overhead to make sure I've centered it. I'm going to give it a nice little wiggle there so it comes out with a clean edge, and that looks just perfect. Now, it's flat. Obviously, I want to give it some contour, and I want to give it the same contour that I gave my basket. I do often dust the top of the cylinder. This is the same cylinder I baked the cookie on, just to make sure the fondant comes off easily, because it has a tendency to stick, believe it or not, a little bit more than my cookie dough does once baked. Now, I could do a bunch and just put them all on the same cylinder and then have them ready to go when I'm making a bunch of baskets for Easter. Okay, so I am going to now spray these pieces before I put them together. I have been spraying a lot in recent videos. It's a great way to add color and sheen without having to ice all of your pieces. It's completely edible. I'm using a PME luster spray. It's just food coloring and alcohol. The alcohol rapidly evaporates, so you can't taste it. But it is a bit of a time saver. It does, however, go everywhere, so I've set up a backdrop and also some paper towels to protect my countertop. Oftentimes I'll work under a hood if I'm doing a lot of these. I'm just doing a couple of quick ones here for demonstration purposes. Okay, so I'm going to completely spray the handle, completely spray the base, and just spray the upper edge of the basket because that's all that's really going to show once we put it together. And my, if I feel like it, I'll spray the whole thing, but I only really need to get the upper half because I'm going to be putting edible lace over it. So give it a good shake. You want to get both sides of the handle. This is bronze and it looks brown on gingerbread, which is kind of nice. Brown is kind of baskety and I like that. So I'm just going to concentrate on the upper edge, maybe the first inch of this. Make sure that's well covered all the way around. Sometimes I will elevate these pieces because it's much easier to get the bottom edge if you can actually get under it. And lastly, we'll do the base. Important mostly to get the edge because a lot of the central part is going to be covered with when the basket is up there. Okay, so on to assembly. They're all sprayed and dried. I can pick them up. I am still, though, picking up this bottom piece largely by the area that's unsprayed. You'll also note before I assemble them that I filed the edges, actually before I even sprayed them, I filed the edges nice and flat, so I've got a nice tight fit of those cylinders on my base. They're all filed down. If you feel you need to do more filing at this point, you can. You can use either a microplaner, which is what this is, a small grater, very fine grater, or broader planed, more conventional grater. Just run it up and down the sides. But mine are a pretty nice fit. And the fit doesn't have to be perfect here. As you can see, look how they're a pretty nice fit. It doesn't have to be perfect though, because as I said, we are covering with SugarVeil, and tiny crevices like those I can fill in with icing. So to glue it together, I put some down the seam, thick royal icing glue again, and some on the base. I have my other piece in the position where I think it's likely going to go, so that I make sure I put this down in a relatively centered position. And now I'm going to apply a little more to this piece, both to the sides and to the bottom edge. You don't need much. Now I'm going to be filling this with stuff at the end, but it's not really intended to be a load-bearing piece. I'd always have a supporting plate like I have up there underneath it. So I'd give that a couple of minutes of drying time so it's not smushing around on the base, not sliding around on the base, before we apply our SugarVeil to it. Let me talk briefly about SugarVeil. SugarVeil is an edible cake glaze. It comes in a powdered form in small packets like this or in larger tubs. And I typically mix 2/3 a cup of powder with 1/3 a cup of water. That's the ratio to pipe with that. That's the perfect piping ratio. We're going to be piping with it later. It's also the ratio for spreading it into mats. You'll spread it into a mat, stick it in the oven, dry it for about 10 minutes, and then it'll pop out in one large big continuous sheet like so. I've already trimmed this piece down to fit around the sides of my basket. Okay, so I'm ready to apply this piece. I think that's enough drying time. And to do that, I'm simply going to apply a little bit of corn syrup to the back. You'll also notice that there is a very clean edge that was formed by unmolding it from the mat. That's the edge of the mat. Whereas this is my cut edge. It's a little more ragged. I'm going to put my cut edge down because I will typically be piping a border at the bottom to conceal it. So it'll be less noticeable if it's down. And this is going to be the front of my basket, so I'm going to apply it front to back with the seams in the back. So just a little bit of corn syrup starting in the center, and then we'll gradually apply it as we move on out. And just lay it up. I'm using my base there as a guide. You'll see that's going to hang until I can get it all the way up. You'll notice I also cut it slightly shorter than the top of the cylinder, and that's done on purpose because the cylinders tend to bow in at the top for whatever reason, and so the lace is less likely to lie flat if I don't trim it a little shorter than the cylinder. The other thing you want to be aware of when applying these needlepoint patterns is that you're applying them vertically, so they're not at all at an angle, because I'm going to be piping a pattern into it. If the lace itself is at an angle, then the pattern, which is defined by the lace, will be at a strange angle too. This looks pretty vertical. All my stripes are going straight up and down. So here's the seam. I think I can cut it right about here with small scissors. Just following the SugarVeil grid to cut it straight. And we'll tack that shut in the back. That looks pretty nice. There it is finished. I'm just going to put my corn syrup away, and then we're going to start filling the holes with the unset SugarVeil mixture. Again, that 2/3 cup powder to 1/3 cup water makes a perfect piping consistency. Before I start piping the SugarVeil in the sides, I just wanted to point out you have different options for the bases. You can ice the base in advance and add a little extra color, as I've done on this basket I've started over here. So that's also an option. It does tend to sit a little more flush, and it's a little easier to get the lace onto an uniced piece. So you have just a couple different ways to go. Sometimes the lace will kind of roll over the edge of this and it'll be a little harder to fit. So to create a straight line going across, I do like to pipe every other hole, because if I pipe them too rapidly next to each other, the beads can sometimes blend into each other and kind of merge together. So by the time I go all the way around this with the white, these should be dry enough that I can put the other ones in between without the beads hitting each other. Okay, so now I'm coming back up to what I had piped before. I just want to carefully put a little in between so as not to cause bleed. And I would continue in that vein all the way around and also create another one about 7 spaces up. Now I'm going to move on to one that I've already started and show you how to lay in other colors around an existing white pattern. So here I filled out all the white, created that central band by framing with 2 white lines, and I've started to lay in the yellow in those diamonds. And I'm going to lay a little bit more yellow along the bottom as I did up here. This yellow is pretty pale compared to the one in the basket, but hopefully you can see it. And as you can see, piping on the diagonal, I can go one after the other really pretty quickly. So I'm back at my back seam. It's not exactly symmetric in the back, but it's symmetric in the back, but it's not, it only goes up 3 high instead of 4 high. So there's always a little bit of discontinuity at the back seam, which is one reason you might want to cover with flowers. So that finishes the yellow. I'm now going to come in with some blue accents, just as I did on the other piece, in these little half diamond areas. Same SugarVeil icing. I just mix my normal liquid gel food coloring into it to give it color. This is my area where the plaque is going to go. And I measured that in advance just to know how wide to make it. There's going to be a little bit of space on either side. I want a little blue also at the bottom, just to balance that out. Same process. And then we'll come with a last bit of purple in a couple of areas. So just a little purple dot in the middle of each yellow diamond. And I'm also going to accentuate the band by piping some purple around that. And this helps bring in the purple that I've got down here, so I'm glad I added it. Okay, so I just want to do a little zigzag border underneath, tiny little zigzag, so up and down, all the way across. And we'll see how it looks at the bottom, and we'll see if we need to add one at the top like I have on the other one. Maybe we won't. So that completes a little bit of purple along the bottom as well. Now in that particular basket, I have a similar effect along the top, but I think I'm going to leave that clean and go ahead and start finishing the border and putting on flowers. So let's talk about base borders. Here I had pre-iced little dots at the bottom. Here I've got a little shell border. I feel like if I were to put a shell border in now here to try to mimic that design, it would really cover a lot of my bottom beadwork, and it looks kind of nice and clean the way it is. So I'm not going to do that, but I am going to show you how I would do it because it is on the other basket. Here I'm using a number 25 star tip, relatively thick lavender icing. Push forward, pull back, push forward, pull back, push forward, pull back, push forward, pull back, push forward, pull back. up against the side of a cookie, it's the same process. I'll do it on the board. Push forward, pull back, push forward, pull back, push forward, pull back. Our plaque's completely dry. Some of our surrounding piping matter is not, so want to be super careful that I don't smudge it. I'm just going to use a little bit of white royal icing glue. It doesn't need to be particularly thick, though mine is, because this is a very light piece, so it will stick with virtually nothing. I just kind of want to make sure it gets centered in this zone. I think that's pretty good. Got to dress up the ends like I did on the other. I've got some small royal icing transfers. I have a whole nother video about how I make these little beads. Very straightforward. It's very similar to how I've made those leaves. I just pipe little dots on acetate and then pop them off later. You could pipe directly on here, but since these are kind of big, they'll be less drippy looking and more well-rounded if I use a transfer. Okay, so that looks cute. And now I'm ready to put flowers on it. This is a little bit like puzzle work, deciding which ones I want to use and how big I want to go. I'm not going to use too many, just a couple. And I'm back to that same green icing that we used before. I'm going to use it as glue. White is sometimes safer because if I decided I didn't want them here, I could more easily move it later. But we're going to be piping leaves around this too, so the green is kind of a natural glue. I'll match those leaves. Yeah, that looks sweet. Okay. And maybe just another flower behind it to hide that big green blob I now have there. Put it a little lower on the edge. Okay, now, of course, we need a few leaves. And for that, I can come to my longer transfers if I like. Like this is a perfect spot for one of them here, I think. These are the pieces, the ferns we made earlier. And in the other picture of the other basket design I have, these ferns actually all reach all the way to the top of the basket, which is kind of cool looking too. Kind of branching out to the back side, just add a little dimension there. And now I'm going to fill in with smaller leaves. Get a few smaller leaves down here. Cover that blob of green icing there. Just a teeny, teeny leaf here, if I can sneak one in. I think that just completes the side really nicely. Okay, so these baskets are all dried and ready to be filled with other Easter goodies and their handles, of course. Now this handle I sprayed earlier. I simply attached some of the flowers we made earlier and also the wafer paper bows with a little bit of thick royal icing, and they've completely dried in place. You can do it on both sides. I've only done it on one side here. The other thing you'll notice is the handle doesn't fit to the sides of the basket, which means I can't easily glue it in place with royal icing. I like the look of that. I like the slim profile of the handle, but I have to find another way of securing it in the basket. And my trick is to actually fill the basket with sanding sugar and to just submerge it in place and prop it up, either with candy Easter eggs, as I've done here, or with some of the sugar flowers. I'm going to try a completely floral basket here. So you can fill it entirely with sugar if you want. You could also fill it with other candies. But sugar is a more compact material and it'll fill it more fully. If you don't want to fill the entire thing with sugar, a little cheat is to put a little dummy bottom in there. That way you'll lose less sugar but still have enough, hopefully, to anchor the handle in place. There, it sits rather nicely on its own. And if you want added stability, you could, of course, stick other flowers up against it to balance it out. You could actually glue those to the base of the handle with royal icing glue, and they would then keep it incredibly secure. But if you want easy access to the cookie piece for eating, this makes it very easy to pull it out when people are ready to do so. So you could just put flowers there, you could put Easter eggs there. We might use some of our longer ferns and things in there as well. I'm also making marshmallow bunnies in my next video, which would look really sweet in these baskets. So till then, live sweetly.